This is the Belle Books and Stories podcast with me, Richard Dykstra. Welcome, you're listening to the Belle Media podcast where we take a look at some great books and the stories behind the books. Today I'm speaking to writer, politician and environmentalist Stanley Johnson. He's worked at the World Bank and for the European Commission. He's been an MEP, is the author of 25 books, and has also been a star of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and stayed at the Real Marigold Hotel. One theme that has run throughout his career is a passionate concern for wildlife and the environment. He's received a Greenpeace Award for outstanding services to the environment, has been an ambassador for the UN Environmental Protection Programme, and is the President Emeritus of the Gorilla Organisation, the organisation that supports the work started by pioneering primatologist Dian Fossey, and working to protect the remaining 1,000 or so gorillas living in the wild in the rainforests of Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Welcome, Stanley. So, Stanley, it's great to have you here for so many reasons, but partly you're here as you've recently re-released Virus. I think you wrote that a good few years ago, in the late 70s?
Well, I did. I wrote it in the late 70s. In fact, it was originally called the Marburg virus and published in the UK by Heinemann, republished in the United States in 2015 under the title The Virus, and now it has been brought out by Black Spring Press in this country being, the United Kingdom, again with the title The Virus. And I'm, very happy that they have been able to do so because, it is a pretty topical story. And the story I told of what happened in my imagination way back in the 70s.
Yeah, I found it a really fascinating story. Obviously, at the moment, we're in this global pandemic. But what I thought was really interesting was the actual genesis of this story, because as you say, it actually comes out of a real incident, which I must admit I hadn't heard of before, but was actually quite a frightening story in itself. Could you tell us a wee bit more about that?
Yes, well, I'm going back to the 70s. I'd been an official of the European Commission, one of the very first, by the way, from this country, when Britain joined the EEC, as it then was, in 1973. I was sent to Brussels as the head of the Prevention of Pollution and Nuisances Division. I was very involved in the whole question of pollution control, health measures. And one of the things I came across, I was having lunch with a friend one day. I'd already written 4 novels, 4 thrillers, more or less environmental thrillers. And I was looking around for a new topic. And a German friend, his name was Franz Froschmar, said, "Oh, well, why didn't you write about what happened in Marburg a few years back?" So I said, "Well, what happened in Marburg?" He said, "Well, there was this outbreak of a tremendous problem, a disease. Subsequently, it's been called the Marburg virus, and everybody who got it actually died. It had virtually 100% mortality rate." And I said, "Well, that sounds extremely interesting. Why haven't we heard more about it?" And he said, "Well, look, I think it all got hushed up a bit." Well, I went off almost the next day, certainly the next weekend, took my car from Brussels, drove. Marburg is not far from Frankfurt, it's on the Lahn, and found this rather wonderful medieval old university town. Beautiful, beautiful place. And that old university town had a medical school, and I started digging around, and yes, I did discover that there had been an outbreak of a disease. A whole lot of medical students had caught it, and almost all of them had actually died. I think the figure was in the 20s, maybe 23, 24, something like that. So then I dug around a bit further. I said, well, why all from the medical school? And then I came across a strange phenomenon, which was that in those old famous university towns, so we're talking about some of the oldest universities in Germany, if not in the world, they have what was called the dueling. They would fight with swords to gain prestige. A dueling club. I think the the German word was something like Schagenderbindung. And this is where my fictional mind came in. I said, well, what if one of those medical students, a member of the dueling fraternity, fraternity was the word they used, had been infected by a disease which he had caught in the course of his work? What kind of disease might that have been? And then I discovered that, and not unusually for medical schools at that time, they were working on primates imported from Africa. In this particular case, they'd been working on monkeys imported from Central Africa. And I tracked it down, as it were, for the purposes of my novel, that the original infection had come from a green monkey imported into Marburg, into the medical laboratory, and probably that was the infected monkey. And then the student, who was also a member of the dueling fraternity, had his cheek slashed, because that's what you do. You gain scars. You keep those scars for the rest of your life. They are marks of honor. He'd been slashed. His blood had spread, infected others, and that had been the beginning of the outbreak. Now, what was really remarkable about this, as I said, was the very high level of mortality. It was absolutely lethal. It was an aerosol. And, we've been wondering now whether COVID-19 is spread through aerosol transmission as well as globules. Maybe a sneeze could infect a crowded cinema. For the purposes of my book, I said, yes, this is one of the things which is a characteristic of the Marburg virus. And that was the beginning of it. And then 10 years later, my hero, because my hero of the book is a man called Lowell Kaplan, who is an epidemiologist. Now we know about epidemiologists. He works for the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, the U.S. very famous center. And he realizes evidence has come that there's been a new outbreak of this disease, the deadliest disease known to man.
I'm struck with the fact that of your two central characters, one is working for the US Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and the other is an eco-warrior in the race to save the world.
Yes, a young lady, in fact, a young lady.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that given today's political climate, the importance of international bodies and people with strong advocacy of conservation, they seem to be two major themes in your life, but they seem to be areas of great political controversy at the moment.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it's funny how several of the novels I have written have, as it were, anticipated real events. Way back in 1968, for example, I wrote a book called Panther Jones for President, which is all about how a black man in America, a black power advocate in America, actually became president of the United States. And I've written other novels which have had similar environmental and ecological themes. And yes, it was good to have this eco warrior lady who is herself horrified at the thought that the international community might decide, as it were, to wipe out a group of monkeys in Central Africa merely because they carried the virus. And in the end, it becomes absolutely clear that what you can't afford to do is to wipe out in nature virus carriers, because they may, in the end, be precisely the group of animals you need if you are to develop effective vaccines. There's this sort of complex. And then, of course, there's also a whole range of what you might call international skullduggery, because you're talking here high politics. Biological warfare was very much a theme way back in the 70s and 80s. Probably it's a theme now. So people who know where a virus is and how to exploit it, of course, they have to be very careful it doesn't backfire on them, which is why the possession of the vaccine is also crucial. So there's this kind of element in the book as well.
No, exactly. So, it's described as a Cold War thriller. And of course, although we thought that the Cold War has kind of disappeared, we seem to be coming into another era of power blocks facing up to each other and trying to destabilize each other. And so perhaps, again, as you say, that I suppose history kind of repeats itself, but not quite in the same way.
Well, and now it remains to be seen what the origin of the COVID-19 is, and there's a lot of controversy about that. I merely read this morning about some Chinese researcher who has now sought refuge in the United States for reasons which are not quite clear, but apparently to do with the fact that she exposed, as she thought, the origin of the Wuhan virus, and she'd been told to shut up in a big way.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, obviously, watch the space on that. Anyways, I say that you better not tell me any more about the virus, or you'll be spoiling my bedtime reading. So moving on to kind of other things in your life, that one of the things that I do know, obviously, is that India seems to have held a bit of a fascination for you. And obviously, I think your last visit might have been 2 years ago at the Rio Marigold Hotel. But I think you first went there in the early 60s. Is that right, by motorbike?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. My first trip to India, and it was some trip, was by motorcycle, yes, in the summer of 1961. I decided with two friends that we would try to follow Marco Polo's route all the way across Europe through Asia, hopefully to get as far as what Marco Polo called Xanadu, but which nowadays is called Beijing. Well, we didn't get as far as China. We couldn't get through from Afghanistan into China. We were late. Had to get back for our Oxford term anyway. The snows had fallen on the Pamir Mountains, which was our route into China. We didn't have a Chinese visa. But what we did instead do was drive down the Grand Trunk Road, the GT Road as they call it, from Kabul in Afghanistan, through the Khyber Pass, down through Pakistan, and then into India at Amritsar, and then right on down the Grand Trunk Road, bypassing Delhi, Agra, on to Lahore, Cawnpore, ending up in Calcutta. So yes, that was my first experience of India. Came back in eventually via Bombay. But I've been back in India many times since then. And actually, yes, you mentioned the Marigold Hotel. That was, of course, a couple of years ago when we spent a month mainly based in Udaipur. But I was there again last year and the year before. In 2018, I was there biking for tigers, an organization called Travel Operators for Tigers. And the idea was to try and construct or encourage the construction of tiger corridors so that tigers could move from one national park to another. Because one thing you absolutely have to do is to try and provide some connectivity between the tiger reserves. Otherwise, you run into tremendous trouble. And so we had a most wonderful time, maybe a dozen of us, on some fairly good bicycles, biking from Pench, which I think is in Madhya Pradesh, to Kana, another national park. And again, I was there last year looking at some parts of India I didn't know. So a wonderful country. Of course, for me, India is politically so tremendously important, as it's one of the main players in what you might call the world effort to deal with climate change. Because without China and without India, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah, okay, well, perhaps we'll come on to that in a minute or so. But back to your trip, I mean, that you're just saying that, well, I did this bike trip. But as far as I understand it, it's about 200 kilometers that you were having to pedal. And I'm told that you did most of it in one gear. Is that right?
Oh no, I don't know about that. No, I had a fantastically good American-made bicycle. I think it was called Trek, something like Trek. And I wouldn't say no. Put it this way: I realized that there were gears on both sides of the handlebars, if you see what I mean. I don't think I ever mastered what went on the left hand side. but even if you just used the gears on the right hand side, you had a pretty good machine to play with.
Yeah, fair enough. And so, in terms of actually going through these tiger reserves, did you see many tigers?
On that occasion, no. But I have seen tigers in India on several occasions over the years. By the way, I've also not seen tigers on several occasions over the years. I mean, you're lucky to see tigers when you go to India. I've seen tigers in Ranthambore. I've seen tigers in Bandhavgarh. I've failed to see tigers in quite a few other places, including, by the way, spending a week not in India, but in Bangladesh, where I was in the Sundarbans looking for the tigers, which do live in that strange mangrove type ecosystem which borders both India and Bangladesh.
Well, you said that you were lucky enough to see some tigers in Banthamgar.
Yes.
Banthamgar is actually where I saw my first tiger, and I have to say I had been to 5 other tiger parks before that, before I actually did see one. And my tiger books are actually based on Banthamgar, really.
Are they? Well, Band of God, that's interesting. Um, I've read your tiger books, of course. We're talking about Tigeropolis. And these are wonderful books. Yes, I'm trying to remember the name of the gentleman who was what's his name? Drew Singh, something like that, who was running Band of God. But a wonderful place. Nowadays, of course, I'm a little bit worried about the way elephants are still being used. I think I'm also one of the founder members of a body called Save the Asian Elephant, and there is a huge amount of abuse involved in, as it were, tourism, which does involve elephants. And Save the Asian Elephant is now lobbying the government hard to try and bring in some regulations dealing with the way in which British tour operators exploit facilities which exploit captive elephants. So this is something which I do believe has to stop. And looking back at my time in Bandhavgarh, I do seem to remember, and you can correct me because you might remember this better, I seem to remember that one of the rides I took was indeed on the back of an elephant and looking down at a tiger in the long grass.
Right, yes, that I've certainly seen elephants uh, in the parks, but not actually seen people on them. I think that they also do, though, use them for sort of anti-poaching patrols and things like that occasionally as well, don't they?
Yes, one of the problems here is that the way these young elephants captured in the wild, they are subjected to the most merciless training. It's called Pajan, and it is absolutely intolerably brutal. And it is something which it shames me that the British tourists, UK tourists, do play a part in this.
I have to say, I have actually seen some wild elephants where we were in one of the old kind of colonial style rest house bungalows in one of the buffer areas. And it was pitch black. We had no electricity or anything like that in the area. And suddenly we just heard this crashing and banging noise and just couldn't understand what was going on. And we eventually went out and couldn't see anything in the dark. But what we were aware of was it was basically a herd of elephants just kind of moving past and just knocking anything down that happened to get in their way. For something that you couldn't see anything on, it was actually an amazing spectacle. Anyway, moving on a wee bit again onto tigers. I also understand that you were at the big global tiger summit that President Putin held in St. Petersburg. I think you were there as an ambassador for the UN Environmental Protection Program at the time.
No, well, it was an extraordinary place in Petersburg. I've been there a couple of times. This was a wonderful meeting because President Putin really put his heart and soul into this, and I think he stayed at the meeting for the whole of the meeting, maybe 2 or 3 days. He was co-chairing the meeting with the then president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, and he managed to get the heads of the so-called Tiger Range states. I would have thought we got very high-level representation from China, from Bangladesh, from India. It was an absolute triumph, and what that meeting did was come up with a tiger conservation plan, and that was an important one. Crucially, of course, it means that organizations like the World Bank and the Global Environmental Facility have to continue, to push on these things, even when there's a change of leadership at the top. Nobody can deny the absolute essential need to press on with tiger conservation in a big way.
I mean, tiger numbers do seem to be increasing, at least in India at the moment. But I think I remember that you referred to this actually in your book, where the wild things were. But one of the things there you mentioned was that you thought that President Putin's commitment really came from the fact that he had personally visited and spent quite a long time in a tiger reserve in Russia's Far East. And you seem to suggest, it was that personal connection that had actually really made things then happen. And the kind of same thing seems to be the case in how Project Tiger in India took hold when Indira Gandhi basically took this on as a kind of personal mission. Do you think that that is really something that has to be learnt, that really that you have to get leaders personally involved in these things to actually make any real progress?
Well, it's not necessarily sufficient to get the leaders involved. You still have to get, in our country at least, parliamentary action. I mean, my own oldest son Boris has exercised quite a lot of leadership, certainly as far as the elephant issue is concerned. And I think he will pursue this on tigers. It definitely helps. And if of course if you have a country which is dominated by one man, as indeed Russia is, then of course his own personal involvement is totally crucial. You might say the involvement of the Russian Parliament is less crucial. As far as India is concerned, yes, I think that Indira Gandhi's involvement in Project Tiger was brilliant. I
So
mean,
Indira Gandhi's personal involvement, as I understand it, really that she is governing a country where obviously the states themselves were also very powerful, but she was such a force of personality that she was able to basically turn around and make this a kind of an all India issue, which really everybody had to get behind. And although there's obviously takes a time to actually change things on the ground, the reality is that over the years things have gradually improved. And now, say, we seem to be in a situation where tigers have gone from about 1,200 or so, I think it was now at one point thought to be as low as that, up to more like about 2,500.
well, it's a pretty tragic situation even now, isn't it? I mean, in the sense that if you consider that the turn of at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the tiger population in India might have been as high as 100,000. It's a pretty tragic situation that we are congratulating ourselves if, we manage to edge it up from 1,500 to 2,000 or 2,500. No, there is a very long way to go. And that is indeed why I was doing my bicycle ride, amongst other things. So what we absolutely have to realize is you must, as it were, enlarge the amount of area which tigers can live and thrive in. And if that means also involving the people, the Indian villages, so that they don't regard tigers as a threat and as a competition, but finding ways where they can live together so the tigers really do have useful corridors between one reserve and another, that is absolutely vital. And one of the things which this project was doing was actually offering compensation to Indian families who had lost livestock, as a result of tiger activities.
Yeah, yes, as I understand it, it's also kind of facilitating the fact that the compensation, I think, is often available from government sources, but it's very difficult to actually get the villagers to get access to that. And they were basically facilitating that to make sure that they would actually be able to get the compensation, instead of what often happens is that the villagers go off and say, well, that tiger's killed our cattle, so we're going to poison the
I know, you
something.
are so right. So this people animal conflict and how to solve that is really at the heart of further measures to protect and expand the tiger populations in India. Absolutely vital.
I mean, I think that these are kind of themes which seem to be almost universal. Most of them takes me on to your book of a few years ago, Where the Wild Things Were, which I thought was a very interesting book because it seemed to be a kind of revisiting themes and places that you'd written about over the past 20, 30 years, and kind of seeing, what had changed. In some places it changed for the better. Some places things hadn't gone quite so well. Looking back at this, are there any memorable experiences that you've had watching wildlife?
Oh, there have been so many, and you rightly mentioned that book I wrote, Where the Wild Things Were. The clue was in the title because it was a rather famous book called Where the Wild Things Are. Well, I think that day when I was in the Sea of Cortez, which is just off the Gulf of California in Baja, to see about 20 blue whales one day, one after another, in that quite restricted area. Yeah, and that was the most wonderful. wonderful thing. What other? Then one day I was trekking in China. I think it was called the Hutong National Park in Shaanxi, and I saw not just one panda but four pandas. One panda was a female panda high up in the tree, and three male pandas had gathered and were circling the tree, waiting to see if the female panda would come down. And then, of course, I think the first time you see a big silverback gorilla in the wild. That for me, that was around about 2008. I was in the eastern Congo. I was in the Kahuzi-Biega National Park. We were with some armed guards because it's not a very safe area to be, and we were hacking our way with the machetes through the jungle. And suddenly, this great, huge, must have been a 350 kilogram male uh, burst into view. And that was the most extraordinary sight, and I described that. The idea was not to make yourself obvious, so my guide said, keep down. And then he said, don't let him see your blonde hair. He may think you're another silverback.
Right, okay, so muscling in his territory, yeah, which probably wouldn't have been a very good thing. I mean, I think when you said you were with armed guards, I mean, the guards weren't really there to protect you against the silverback, were they? They'd be
No. They were protected against the other sort of guerrilla warfare which was going on in the Eastern Congo at that time, and still, by the way, does go on. These are not particularly safe areas to work in. As you mentioned in your introduction, I am the president of the guerrilla organization, and we are working in the Eastern Congo, and of course in Uganda and in Rwanda, and these are not easy moments, and we have had guards who have been killed.
obviously it's a difficult at the best of times, but with COVID as well, that a lot of the money that goes into these areas it actually comes from tourism and the permits to go and see gorillas and things like this, and presumably all of that stopped at the moment. So, what's happening on the ground?
Very good point there. And what you have to remember is this question of the transmission of disease, zoonosis, or whatever the word is. It's not just in the direction of animals to man. You can have it the other way around too, man to animals. So yes, the tourism has indeed been stopped at the moment. I think that's perfectly right because it's no good getting close to a gorilla if you can. Well, of course, in the old days, you would give it a cold as well, but giving it a coronavirus is maybe worse than that.
Yeah, well, that one of the things about that pandemic at the moment is that I think it has made us all have a bit of time for reflection about how the world is changing and what we've done to the planet and trade-offs and things like this. Is there anything that you think is we should be optimistic about in what's been happening and our ability to kind of rethink how we approach the world?
Well, I think you could be optimistic and you could say this COVID-19 episode, this coronavirus episode, has given us a moment to pause, to rethink. Will the world which emerges from coronavirus be a different world? Will we, for example, seize the opportunities we now have to reformulate our industrial basis, really move towards, sustainable energy platforms and so on and so forth, change the agricultural practices where we can. I would say that there's some real possibilities here. If you look at it in terms of the carbon budget, I haven't yet seen, the detailed calculations, but I can't help thinking that the impact of the economic downturn must, as it were, have given us a tiny bit more breathing space in terms of that carbon budget than we anticipated. Do you see what I mean? I haven't, as I say, I haven't seen the figures, but I can't believe that we will not have seen a fall off in at least the rate of increase of some of the CO2 emissions over the last years.
So this year we should have had COP26, the climate conference in Glasgow, but that, of course, has now been postponed until next year to November 2021. So perhaps that is going to be actually a good thing, that is giving us a bit more time to think about what should be happening. Do you think that these summits really can achieve what is needed?
Well, if you consider it took almost 30 years to get from October 1986, which was the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, to the Paris meeting of December 2015, which produced the so-called Paris Convention. Well, that was a lot of time, a huge amount of time. And the other thing you have to say is that convention, is it up to the job? You could say it's the only thing we've got at the moment, and that is true. But it is a voluntary convention. The so-called indicative national emission reductions, whatever they're called, they're voluntary. The convention is in real trouble in the sense that the Americans are pulling out. One of the issues I think will have to be, as you look at the rescheduled COP26, rescheduled for Glasgow again, is whether or not you need to add another element to that convention, which you might say is the carbon tax element. And the essence of that would be to legitimize trade barriers, which can be implemented legally in WTO terms if one country is, as it were, exploiting carbon-intensive industries without taking into account the effect of its emissions. Do you see what I mean? Whereas another country might have a big carbon reduction program. So what I'm trying to get at is there has to be something like a kind of agreed carbon tax level. If a country is not doing that, then it must face trade barriers. What has to be brought into the Paris thing is the element of hardening element of teeth here, and that is going to require, I think, some changes in our thinking, particularly in WTO terms.
Right, so it's possible that the extra year and the kind of changes that have been thrown up by COVID-19 might actually allow a bit more time for these ideas to gain a bit more currency then.
That's right. I don't suppose there's time between now and November 2021 to agree this extra economic element I was talking about, but at least we could get the ball rolling fairly efficiently.
So I was just actually also thinking, and you were kind of mentioning it there, that perhaps there's actually a bit of a lesson from your book as well in all these things. Your book was written in what's it 78, 79. The events that actually inspired it happened in 67. I think the first UN Environmental Conference was probably about 72 or something like that.
It was, yeah.
There's a kind of common thread about events that were first outlined, 40 odd years ago, but not initially given enough attention by politicians because of their understandable concerns about immediate short-term problems. But actually, all these kind of underlying issues have this remarkable tendency to bite back with a vengeance. So they can't be ignored and swept under the carpet.
Well, in another month or two, Richard, this same publisher, which is, as I mentioned, Black Spring, is going to bring out another book of mine, which has also been published in America, republished in America, called The Warming. And that is a thriller I've written about global warming, which again is a good adventure thriller involved in trying to solve global warming. In this particular case, I'm imagining that some of the rocks which Captain Scott brought back from Antarctica do indeed include or contain the magic ingredient you need to deal with global warming. Anyway, that's another thriller which is on the stocks and will be out another month or two.
Okay, well, perhaps that's a great place to close. Thank you for being with me today. It was a real pleasure to hear your story, Stanley. I should just say that The Virus is available from all good bookshops and online from Watson's and Amazon. And as, of course, from Tigers, well, you know that my Tigeropolis books, you can find them in bookstores and Amazon and at scotlandbymail.com. So thank you for listening to Books and Stories. The studio production was by Perrin Sledge. I'm Richard Dykstra. Hope you'll join us next time. Bye for now.